Hi, welcome to our very exciting module on global warming. This lecture is going to be a little bit shorter than the previous lectures that you've experienced because I'm just trying to give you the background for the future reading that you're going to perform in this module and give you the background that you're going to need to have for your completion of the SimBio exercise. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to talk about global warming, and in this particular lecture we're going to start by talking about temperature, global temperature, and how temperature affects living organisms, which I'm sure you can think about some ways it does. We're going to reiterate the carbon cycle, which has been a very important theme. That's a recurring theme in our lectures, so we're going to go over it one more time very quickly. Then we're going to discuss greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect, and how this is linked to global warming and what global warming really means and what the reasons that the Earth is getting warmer are, and some of the effects of the Earth getting warmer. Let's get started. So we know that there are a lot of biotic factors that affect living organisms, and biotic factors, as the name implies, are biologically related, and then there are abiotic factors that are not biologically related that affect you as an organism and other organisms that are on Earth. So some examples of abiotic factors are temperature, water, sunlight, wind, rocks, things that are not alive. And the important element that we're going to be focusing on in this lecture is temperature. So how does temperature affect you as an organism? I'm sure that you have some personal experience with how temperature affects you, but let's talk a little bit about how the proteins and enzymes in your body function when we change temperature around. So temperature is, of course, a very important factor in the distribution of organisms because a lot of organisms depend on a very particular range of temperature for their biological processes to occur as naturally as they have evolved. There are some limitations to temperatures under which organisms can thrive. For example, in freezing conditions, a lot of living organisms have cells, and oftentimes these cells will rupture if they encounter freezing temperatures below 0 degrees centigrade. And in boiling temperatures above 45 degrees centigrade, usually your proteins denature, much like an egg. When you fry it, the egg goes from liquid to solid. So that is due to the denaturation of proteins. So you don't want to be in a situation where you are boiling. So mammals and birds, we are endotherms, so we expend energy to keep our body warm. Here are two different organisms. So here's a mammal, for example, and the otter is the example of this temperature regulator, and it's showing you in this red line that if we look at the ambient temperature that the otter is present in here on the x-axis, so the otter can let's say exist in temperatures ranging from about 3 to about 32, it's comfortable there. And no matter what the ambient temperature is, the temperature inside the otter is going to be pretty much consistent around 37. And that's true for you as well. However, a fish, which is a temperature conformer, meaning it's going to conform its body temperature to the local environment that it's in, is going to linearly change the temperature of its body with respect to ambient temperature. So as ambient temperature increases, similarly, the body temperature of the fish will increase as well. And when we have that nice straight line that is exactly 45 degrees from the ambient temperature from the x-axis to the y-axis, we can see that beautiful linear relationship between those two elements. So I did briefly mention that much like we experience a comfortable range in which we like to live, a large part of this is because our proteins inside our body can function within a range of temperatures, and we have evolved to thrive in a temperature that is somewhat similar to our body temperature, maybe a little bit lower. In other situations, proteins inside other organisms that are that live in different temperatures have been optimized to thrive in that temperature. So let's look at some examples on the graph. Let's look at some data. Here is, in the black line, an optimal temperature for the typical human enzyme, and we can see that if we plot the rate of reaction that an enzyme can perform, and here's the temperature, the different temperatures at which the activity of this enzyme was tested, we can see that at low temperatures the activity is quite low, so the reaction proceeds slowly. So that's an indication that the enzyme or the protein inside this organism is not, inside the human for example, is not functioning very well. So if I put you at temperatures close to, or if your body gets cold, the enzymes and the proteins inside your body are not going to be able to function very well. And we're seeing that here graphically, that at low temperatures the reaction proceeds slowly because the protein is not active. As the temperature increases, we're going to reach a point where we've reached the highest activity for this enzyme. So the highest activity is the optimal temperature at which this enzyme operates. And that's about 37 here, which is how warm your body is. And then there's a steep drop off right after that. So what happens when your body overheats? What happens to the proteins inside your body? I briefly mentioned that previously. So your proteins are basically boiling, much like a cooked egg. If we look at an enzyme that lives in a deep thermal vent, for example, so deep thermal vents are in the bottom of the ocean and they spew out hot water, much like hot springs in Wyoming or Iceland. You have these geothermal warming of water that comes up to the surface, and you have actually microscopic and single cell organisms that can live in that very hot temperature, whereas you could not. So what is the reason behind their ability to live in this very hot temperature? Well, their enzymes have adapted over time and have evolved to be able to perform reactions at that very high temperature. So they're showing you that a thermophilic or a heat temperature bacteria, the optimal temperature is going to be here around 75. So the curve is just shifted. Of course, most living organisms that we encounter are more in this range here. And the graph on the bottom is just showing you that we've evolved to adapt to a lot of different conditions. So for example, the acidity, the local acidity is another condition that proteins have evolved to. So the proteins inside your stomach are used to a very acidic environment and they've evolved to be very active at a pH of 2. So this should bring you back to our lecture on acid rain and remind you of pH and what that means. So again, a lot of different single cell organisms, so in this case we're looking at different kinds of bacteria, have evolved to have different ranges of temperatures that they thrive under. So a lot of the bacteria that we encounter or that live in our body are these right here, and we can see that they've been optimized to 37, which is the temperature of human bodies or mammalian bodies for the most part. And then we have these other curves for bacteria that live in warmer temperatures or bacteria that live in cooler temperatures. What's important for you to remember is that we have this optimal temperature at the peak, and then we have a minimum and a maximum temperature under which that protein can be active at all. So there is an upper and a lower limit of the activity of that enzyme. Let's switch gears and talk about climate. Climate refers to the long-term weather patterns that exist in an area. So it's not weather and it's not seasons, it's more of a global pattern that's existing over time. We can look at climate in small regions or big regions, so we can look at macroclimates on the global and local level, and we can look at microclimates that occur in very small areas. Globally, climate is determined by the sun hitting the Earth and how the planet moves through the solar system. And the way our planet moves changes based on seasons, and also our planet actually starts tilting slightly different ways every 100,000 years or so, and that plays a role in ice ages, for example. So sunlight, the intensity determines a large part of Earth's climate. Just the amount of sunlight hitting an area because of where that area is positioned on the globe. So the incoming angle of sunlight that hits that area is going to change the local climate of that area. So for example, sunlight that hits the equator is going to be stronger and more dense, so there's going to be more light per square meter or whatever unit of measurement you prefer to use than the amount of sunlight hitting an area at a higher angle. So let's look at that in a slightly different diagram. So here we're looking at three rays. We're looking at the same amount of sunlight hitting in A and B. However, in A, these same three rays are distributed over a larger area, whereas in B, those three rays are distributed over a smaller area. So this is just one example of how sunlight itself is a determinant of climate. And we talk about global warming, and I'm sure you've heard the term frequently, either in the news or in other situations, and people talking about the Earth warming and how this is going to be a pretty significant change in our future if the Earth continues to warm. So let's talk a little bit about what this means, what causes global warming, and what the consequences of global warming are going to be. So one thing that human activity has contributed to changing the Earth's climate is by releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we've contributed to the warming of Earth. Do you remember the carbon cycle? I hope you do. It's such an important cycle to remember. So here is the distribution of carbon in our ecosystem. We know a lot of it is underground, for example, in the form of fossil fuels. So we talked a lot in the previous lecture, the energy lecture, of oils and gasoline and coal and all of these sources of carbon that are present underground for the most part, that humans have harvested and burned to power their automobiles and to put electricity into their houses and into their industrial complexes. So we've moved carbon from the Earth into the atmosphere by burning these fossil fuels. And if that is something that you'd like to go back and read up on, you can go back to our energy lecture. So that thick red line on the left is showing you that we've moved carbon from underground deposits into the atmosphere. And the other way we've affected carbon distribution is by reducing the amount of photosynthesis that happens on Earth. So, why is photosynthesis so important for the carbon cycle? Can you answer that question? We know that plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and take that carbon from the carbon dioxide and incorporate it into initially glucose, but then more complex molecules that they make themselves out of. So plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and make plant matter out of that carbon. So they're essentially sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, and over time, as plants die, that carbon will go back into the earth, or if plants are eaten, that carbon will go into another organism, and that reduces the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and puts it into a different form that is present on the ground. How have we reduced the amount of carbon sequestration on Earth? So if we look at a map of net primary production, we know that primary production is the amount of mass that plants produce. So the amount of kilograms of carbon in terms of plant matter that is being produced per meter square per year. So we can look at a map of the Earth, and we see very clearly that in the Amazon, this region that is lighting up over here, there's a ton of primary production. So a lot of plants are taking CO2 from the atmosphere and creating carbon plant material. And by cutting down trees, humans are reducing that primary production, and we're reducing the amount of CO2 that's being taken out of the atmosphere. Now we've affected, the next few graphs are going to show you the greenhouse effect, and then we're going to talk about all of these carbon emissions, that these greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere. This infographic is showing you the types of gases that we're putting into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide being a big contributor of all of these gases, and this is due to burning of fossil fuels and other human activities. And just as a reminder, if we break down on the bottom here the contribution of different sectors to the increase in these gases in the atmosphere, we see that electricity and transportation are pretty much the major contributors. So what is the greenhouse effect? We know that Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere, and we talked about this in the air lecture. So again, if you want to go back and review the atmosphere and its different components, this would be a perfect time to go back and review it. So this picture here is showing you in this kind of blue hazy circle that we have these gases that envelop Earth. We know that there is a large amount of radiation coming from the sun into the surface of Earth, so that's shown here in these orange lines. So all of the sunlight's coming through, and the Earth itself gives off infrared radiations, and most of it gets through that layer of gases and escapes out into the solar system. As we increase the layer of these gases, more and more of that infrared radiation is going to be reflected back to Earth. So it's not going to escape into the solar system, and it's not going to let Earth cool off in that way. However, reflecting that radiation back onto Earth is going to actually warm it up, and it's going to maintain a hotter temperature than it would if this radiation were allowed to leave Earth and cool Earth down. Here's a slightly different diagram demonstrating the same thing. So you can read this infographic, but basically sunlight is coming into our atmosphere. Some of it gets reflected back by our atmosphere, so they're showing you here this light bouncing back. Some of it gets absorbed through the atmosphere and it hits Earth and it warms Earth up. It warms the clouds up, and when the Earth and the clouds warm up, they emit infrared radiation, so they are emitting heat, and this little red arrow here is showing you that infrared radiation can leave the atmosphere and escape into the solar system. However, in the presence of greenhouse gases, this infrared radiation is being reflected back to Earth, and this also in turn leads to clouds warming up, and that reflects more infrared heat back onto Earth. So this is how Earth is warming up due to these greenhouse gases. So what are sources of these greenhouse gases? This nice cartoon here is showing you a lot of the different sources that humans have contributed to greenhouse gases. Of course, greenhouse gases were present before humans came around, but we are increasing the amount of greenhouse gas dramatically. So we are contributing a large amount of greenhouse gases over a pretty short amount of time. So that's the difference between natural greenhouse gases and the ones that we've contributed. Where is the sources of greenhouse gases that humans have brought? So agriculture produces a lot of greenhouse gases, a lot of methane from the cattle and animals that we grow. Other agriculture, even growing plants contributes to greenhouse gases. Landfills, so decomposition of our trash and food waste that we produce produces carbon dioxide. So when bacteria digest down your garbage, they perform respiration much like you do, and they take in oxygen and they release carbon dioxide much like you do. So just the act of decomposition releases a lot of carbon dioxide, and since humans produce a lot of waste, there's a lot of decomposition. Factories and burning of fossil fuels is some of the largest contributors to carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, so that's a huge contributor of greenhouse gases. And then deforestation, so reducing the amount of vegetation that we have, the amount of trees that can sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, much like we just discussed. Here are different types of greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons. If you recall, we talked about CFCs in our air module when we talked about ozone. And if you also recall, we looked at how long these CFCs are retained in the atmosphere, and you can see in this column on the right that they stay in the atmosphere very, very long periods of time, for very long periods of time, for hundreds of years, and exert a lot of damage that way. In comparison, methane might stay in the atmosphere for 12 years, which is still a pretty significant amount of time, and nitrous oxide could stay in the atmosphere for 114 years. So all of these greenhouse gases are very long living, and that is why even if we modify our behavior immediately today, there's going to be effects of these greenhouse gases on global warming for quite some time after we modify our behavior. So that's why it's really important that we try to reduce as humanity, as the human race, we try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit, because the effect of these greenhouse gases are going to live for much longer than we do. Which greenhouse gases are contributed most from which sector? So where do these greenhouse gases come from? Methane comes largely from livestock digestion. So just by living, actually, cows are contributing a pretty large amount of methane to the atmosphere. Landfills, so our methane is also part of decomposition, so a lot of methane goes into the air that way. Nitrous oxide is the second box there, so that is mostly due to agricultural solids. And carbon dioxide, as you might guess, now that you've watched the energy lectures, carbon dioxide is mostly contributed by burning fossil fuels. Let's look at the quantification of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over time. So this graph is looking at 10,000 years ago to present, and you might observe that there are fluctuations over time. However, if we focus on the last 100 or 200 years, we see a very, very sharp spike up of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide due to human activity. And the beginning of the spike, the beginning of this uptick correlates perfectly with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that occurred, where we start producing greenhouse gases rapidly in our factories and by manufacturing things and burning coal and burning